The iron stench of blood clung to the dungeon stones like old incense. It mixed with the sour reek of sweat, rot, and urine, an air so thick it coated the tongue before the scream could even rise. In the flickering torchlight, a man twitched beneath chains, his body contorted like a broken marionette. His hands were bound behind his back with leather straps soaked in salt water, tightened until the flesh puckered and swelled violet. But it was his face that held the true horror. His lips had been sewn shut with golden thread, not roughly, not hastily, but with the precision of a jeweler or a surgeon, each stitch tight, deliberate, gleaming in the low light like sacred filigree on a reliquary. It was obscene a punishment that resembled art. From his nostrils, thick strings of snot and blood trailed downward, over a jaw spasming from hunger. The hunger was not symbolic. It was real. He hadn't eaten in days. Before him stood a silver tray, placed delicately on a pedestal just out of reach. On it sat roasted meats, honey-soaked dates, soft bread drizzled in oil, and figs split open like wounds, all perfumed with rare spices from Parthia and Libya. The food was untouched, warm, fresh, refreshed daily. Each morning, a slave in silence replaced the tray, while another washed the floor of the previous day's vomit and blood. Neither dared speak. No one did. That was part of the ritual. Behind a silk curtain, Emperor Commodus watched. He sat on a reclining couch carved from onyx, bare-chested, his hair perfumed with saffron oil, a lion pelt slung over one shoulder. In his hand was a goblet not of wine, but of ox blood thinned with water, said to sharpen the senses. His expression was one of distant curiosity, the way one might study the twitching of a beetle pinned through its back. The man before him, once a minor noble, accused of whispering treason at a private banquet, had not been sentenced to death. Death was too final. Commodus had declared, before an amused court, that he wished to observe the hunger of a traitor, no more, no less. When asked for clarification, he only smiled. "Let us see how much of himself he truly loves," he said. And so the nobleman, whose name history does not preserve, was taken to the substructures of the Palatine and placed in this room of slow, methodical madness. By the third day, he had begun to whimper at the food. He would shuffle forward on his knees, lips torn and bleeding beneath the stitches, rubbing his face against the pedestal's edge, trying to absorb moisture from the fruit. His tongue swelled with thirst. His eyes yellowed with the bile of starvation. But what broke him was not the food. It was the meat of his own arms. First he chewed the skin. Then, beneath the skin, the muscle. He tried to scream. Only blood hissed through his nostrils. Commodus watched it all with the same expression he wore at the amphitheater. Fascination without empathy. The noble's descent into self-cannibalism was not an accident, but a crafted descent, a fall engineered with precision. And it was not unique. In the months leading to this, Commodus had begun orchestrating similar performances in the lower palace. A slave girl was ordered to eat stones shaped like fruit until her gut split. A senator's wife was locked in a room with her dead infant and told to make a meal of it or die herself. In each case, the emperor watched not with lust, but with a deep, abstract hunger, not for flesh, but for the moment the soul broke. He was not alone. His closest attendants stood behind him now. Marcia, the emperor's favored concubine, who wept each night but never looked away. Cleander, the chamberlain whose silence bought power. and Narcissus, the gladiator tutor, whose eyes were dull from seeing too much. They stood in a triangle behind the silk curtain, witnessing not justice, not vengeance, but the theater of cruelty, the sacred inversion of Rome's virtues where power was no longer tempered by duty, but enthroned in spectacle. Outside, the city breathed as usual. Bakers kneaded dough. Philosophers debated in colonnades. Priests offered incense to long-dead gods. But beneath the stones, in a chamber without name, the empire had revealed its marrow, a ruler who punished not to correct, but to consume. Eventually, on the seventh night, the man gnawed so deeply into his forearm that a tendon snapped and curled out of the wound like a white worm. His body convulsed. Blood spurted in irregular arcs. Commodus rose slowly and approached the veil, casting it aside. In the torchlight, his face glowed with a strange tenderness, not of mercy, but of recognition. He knelt beside the dying man and touched the weeping eyes with his thumb. Then he whispered, "You've feasted well." That night, the tray was removed, the body left to rot, the chamber was not cleaned. The next morning, a new victim was chosen, a young boy from Alexandria, accused of mocking the emperor's resemblance to Hercules. He would not be sown, merely starved, for variety. And so, the chamber awakened again. Rome did not notice. Rome, by then, was already asleep. He was born into gold, not merely the gold of coin or crown, but the kind that clung to the skin like divine oil. From the moment Commodus emerged from the womb of Faustina the Younger in 161 CE, the empire whispered of omened stars pulsing in the midday sky, an eagle perching on the newborn's crib, priests dreaming of Jupiter handing down a child of fire. But prophecy is not providence, and blood, even the blood of emperors, can fester. Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the reluctant Caesar, the stoic ruler who wrote meditations on duty as he warred against the Marcomanni in frozen northern forests. But Marcus, for all his virtue, failed where it mattered most. He failed as a father. In his obsession with shaping Rome, he neglected the boy he would leave behind to rule it. While Marcus penned wisdom in his tent by candlelight, young Commodus roamed the imperial palace under the care of nurses, slaves, and flatterers. He was raised not on philosophy, but performance praised for cruelty, rewarded for tantrums. When he beat another child into unconsciousness with a statuette of Mars, the tutor was executed for not removing the weapon fast enough. When he tortured a peacock by plucking its feathers one by one, a crowd of sycophants applauded. The boy learned that suffering could be beautiful, if arranged correctly. By age 12, Commodus had his own private arena in the palace gardens, where animals were tied down and sliced open in ways that amused him. Peacocks, wolves, even a chained leopard all made to bleed beneath the boy's gaze. It was here, among gushing arteries and the cheers of his playmates, that a seed took root that life, if not feared, was worthless. Faustina, his mother, did not live long enough to stop it. Rumors swirled that she took her own life after an affair with a gladiator. Others whispered that she was poisoned by Marcus for treason. Either way, her absence left a void. Commodus filled with myth, he began referring to himself as born of Mars, not Marcus. At 13, he declared himself the true Hercules. At 15, he demanded portraits be redone to depict him with the lion-skin cloak and club. His father sighed. He obeyed. The philosophers of Rome, Galen among them, attempted to curb the boy's madness with education. But for every passage of Plato read, Commodus tore 2 pages from Livy to feed the brazier. For every lecture on virtue, he demanded a demonstration of vice. Galen once recalled, bitterly, that Commodus preferred the moans of suffering to the murmur of truth. When Marcus Aurelius finally died in 180 CE, his lungs consumed by plague in the forests of Pannonia, Commodus was just 19. The transition was immediate and brutal. The armies were called back from the frontier. Treaties were signed not out of strength, but exhaustion. The war was ended, not with triumph, but withdrawal. Rome turned inward, and at its center, the boy emperor bloomed into something monstrous. His first decree was to elevate the days of games. What had once been festivals became seasons. Blood flowed in the Colosseum nearly without pause. But these were not the old gladiatorial combats of discipline and skill. Commodus turned them into theater himself as star. Draped in lion skins, he would descend into the arena and butcher tied-down animals for adoring crowds, ostriches beheaded with crescent arrows, bears gutted with barbed tridents. Once, he split a man in half from shoulder to groin and laughed when the torso crawled away. He did not see this as cruelty. He saw it as divinity. Rome had worshipped gods born of pain, why not him? But there was something deeper than ego behind his eyes. Not madness in the simple sense, but something feral, inherited. For Marcus Aurelius, restraint was virtue. For Commodus, it was starvation. He believed that the strong should never deny their impulses, only refine them into rituals. Thus, torture was not chaos, it was choreography. Death was not punishment, it was revelation. He began to surround himself with the beautiful broken, slaves with flayed backs and painted faces, eunuchs who danced with hooks in their flesh, priests who whipped themselves into visions. They filled the palace like ghosts in a fever dream. Commodus gave them names, fed them honeyed milk, and asked them to scream in rhythm when he slept. Outside the palace walls, famine crept across the empire. The Nile had failed, grain prices soared, Rome's lower classes rioted in the forums, and yet Commodus spent more money on white marble statuary of his own face than on bread. He ordered entire neighborhoods razed to make room for his temple to Hercules. He declared the months renamed in his honor. August became Commodus August. October became Hercules Romanus. The city became a shrine to one man's diseased reflection. Those who protested quietly or otherwise vanished. A senator who warned of tyranny cloaked in pageant was found crucified upside down in his own garden, mouth stuffed with grapes. A priest who refused to recognize the emperor's divinity was drowned in a vat of sacramental wine. The message was clear. Doubt is disloyalty, and disloyalty is death. And yet, even among the ruins of the Senate's authority, some whispered of resistance. Not open rebellion. Rome was too exhausted, but of quiet revolutions. Secret messages carved into bathhouse tiles, meetings in the back rooms of bakeries, faces turned away from imperial statues. These were not acts of power, but of memory attempts to remember Rome as it had once been. Commodus, in turn, responded not with armies, but with spectacle. He believed that fear must be renewed like fire, never left to smolder. And so, the punishments grew stranger. A man accused of conspiracy was sealed in a bronze coffin filled with bees. Another was fed ground glass for weeks until his organs shredded from within. But it was the nobleman in the dungeon, the one sewn at the mouth, that became the symbol of Commodus's new philosophy, that the human body could be made to consume itself, if denied dignity long enough. To force a man to eat himself was not merely punishment, it was metaphysical domination, a complete erasure of identity, reason, and even hunger, until pain was the only god left to worship. The people applauded, or rather, they were paid to. Coins thrown from balconies silenced conscience. Bread, when it came, was still bread. And above all, fear did what virtue could not. It kept the streets quiet. In the heart of Rome, beneath columns etched with the glories of past emperors, a new inscription was carved by trembling hands into the stone of a well. He makes us gods by making us beasts. And the beast sat on his throne, smiling. By the second year of his reign, Commodus no longer ruled Rome as an emperor. He ruled it as a performer. His theater was the city itself. His stage was the body his own and that of every trembling subject. And like all great performers, Commodus began to demand not just applause, but worship. But worship alone was not enough. It had to be rehearsed, repeated, refined, ritualized. The first of these rituals was blood, not war blood, not sacrifice in the old religious sense, but entertainment blood stylized, choreographed, and multiplied. Gladiatorial games ballooned from monthly pageants to weekly exhibitions, then daily, then, eventually, without pause. Commodus would often fight himself, standing in the arena in gleaming bronze, his chest oiled and bare, proclaiming himself the new Romulus, the invincible son of Jupiter, and most often, Hercules reborn. But unlike the old gladiators who fought for skill or honor, Commodus rewrote the rules. His opponents were tied down, blinded, or crippled before entering the ring. Slaves with one leg, men with no arms, prisoners with tongues removed. He would slay them in elaborate fashion, a spear through the eye socket, a curved blade through the groin, and then demand the crowd cheer as if he had faced a lion. Then came the lions, caged and starved beasts, imported from Nubia and Germania, were loosed into the arena. Commodus would descend with a golden bow, arrows tipped with bone and dipped in wine. He shot them from balconies, laughing as the arrows pierced the creatures' lungs, watching them stagger and howl as the sand drank their death. He once slew a giraffe and called it a demon of the desert. The crowd had never seen a giraffe. They believed him. But what began as sport soon spiraled into something darker. The killings became ceremonial. Each victim was given a title, a narrative, a sin to atone. Commodus no longer simply executed criminals, he invented their crimes. One man, accused of lying breath, was forced to drink molten lead. Another, condemned for arrogant posture, had his spine broken backwards over a wheel carved to resemble the crescent moon. These were not random cruelties. They were rites, and Commodus was the high priest. Within the bowels of the palace, a private chamber was converted into what Marcia, his concubine, once called the Room of Reversals. There, rituals were performed not for the gods, but for Commodus himself. Each object had meaning, a brazier of burning papyrus for the sin of memory, a pit of ink for the punishment of knowledge, a bronze anvil to smash the fingers of scribes who had written poetry deemed insufficiently flattering. Victims were chosen for symbolic reasons. A man with a clear voice might have his throat flayed to silence hubris. A woman with beautiful eyes had them gouged to restore humility. Commodus believed this was balance, not madness. He once told a visiting dignitary from Antioch, "Rome has become unclean. I purify her with justice carved into flesh." No one dared disagree. Soon, his obsession with ritual reached the Senate. He began requiring senators to wear gladiatorial garb to meetings. Those who refused were whipped and paraded nude through the streets, their skin painted in red ochre to signify blood they had not yet shed. The message was clear: you are not exempt. You are mine. One senator, Pertinax, tried to protest. A former soldier, old and proud. He stood during a gathering and asked, "Are we priests or clowns?" Commodus smiled. The next morning, Pertinax awoke to find a goat's heart nailed to his door, a warning. 2 days later, his wife was found drowned in a basin of milk, her body draped in senator's robes stitched from pigskin. By this time, the people no longer knew what was law and what was performance. Taxes were announced through parades of naked children dressed as cupids. Grain rations were distributed with scrolls signed in blood. Once, Commodus burned 100 loaves of bread and threw the ashes into the Tiber to cleanse the hunger of ingratitude. And yet, the crowds still came, still cheered, not out of loyalty that had long been bled from them, but because silence was a safer ritual than resistance. Commodus had made fear a daily offering, and the people had become priests in their own survival. The ultimate ritual, the one that cemented his descent, came during what he called the Festival of Human Triumphs. For 30 days, Rome was locked into a cycle of horror. Each day, a citizen of a different rank was chosen to be transformed. A merchant was buried in boiling sand until only his eyes remained visible. A priest was sewn into a fresh horse carcass and left for 3 days until scavengers found him. A child, a mute boy who had drawn a caricature of the emperor in the dirt, was placed in a cage with dogs, his arms painted in meat grease. At the center of the festival stood a single man, the same man from the dungeon. His lips had long since rotted away from the golden stitching. He no longer screamed. He only bit. He had gnawed off 2 fingers, part of his own cheek, and 1 foot. Commodus declared him the oracle of hunger and placed him atop a marble pedestal as a living statue. Each day, citizens were forced to bow to him, a man turned into his own predator, while Commodus watched, smiling. To refuse was death. To comply was madness. In these rituals, Commodus found what his father never did: control without conscience, order without virtue, worship without love. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana. Every temple bore his image. Every decree began with the words, "From the mouth of Hercules." But there was no divinity left, only the theater of ruin. And deep within the palace, surrounded by the scent of burning parchment, crushed petals, and spilled blood, Commodus began to believe the greatest ritual still awaited a transformation so complete that no one, not even the gods, could touch him. He would become the god of Rome by unmaking every piece of Rome that remembered it was once human. The palace walls no longer whispered. They howled low, constant, like wind passing through catacombs filled with teeth. By the 5th year of his reign, Emperor Commodus no longer concerned himself with pleasing the people, nor even ruling the empire. What he wanted now was submission of a different kind, not from the masses, who had long since learned to bow and cheer at command, but from those who still dared wear robes stitched in old authority, the senators, the patricians, the ancestral elite who still clung to the illusion that Rome was something bigger than the man who sat upon its throne. To Commodus, these were not men. They were statues waiting to be shattered. He began quietly, at first calling a few senators to private dinners where the wine was thick, the laughter forced, and the exits watched by guards with smiles sharper than their swords. During one of these dinners, Lucius Petronius, an old patrician whose family had sat in the Senate since the time of the Republic, dared to correct the emperor when he claimed that Mars had personally gifted him his bronze gauntlets. "My lord," Petronius said gently, "surely you mean the temple priests who consecrated them." He did not finish the sentence. Commodus clapped once, the sound echoing like the crack of a whip. Two eunuchs entered the room with red cords and dragged Petronius from the table, not to prison, but to the Hall of Echoes, a small, circular room deep within the palace, where screams ricocheted for hours before fading. Petronius was not executed. That would be too quick, too charitable. Instead, he was sewn into a sack along with a dog, a rooster, and a snake, a punishment used once for parricides, now repurposed for the crime of contradiction. The sack was tossed into the Tiber at dawn, and Commodus made a new rule: every senator must now refer to him as Dominus et Deus Lord, and God not merely in court, but in all private correspondence. But titles were never enough. The emperor had grown addicted to watching the powerful unravel. He began ordering midnight raids on senatorial villas, each one more theatrical than the last. In one case, he sent actors dressed as furies to pound on the doors of a prominent family, wailing verses from Euripides and demanding atonement. In another, he had centurions paint blood across a senator's wall in the shape of a lion's maw, a symbol the emperor had begun to associate with his divine alter ego. The arrests multiplied. The charges were often nonsense whispers against Olympus, breath offensive to Hercules, unauthorized mourning, treasonous posture. Whole families were seized, husbands dragged from bed while their wives were forced to watch, children taken to the palace and never seen again, their estates confiscated, their names erased from the rolls, and in the ashes of their ruin, Commodus built monuments to himself, statues with his face wearing the crown of Apollo, crushing snakes underfoot. Yet, for all the terror, there were some who resisted in silence. They met in cellars and atriums, speaking in riddles, referring to Commodus not by name, but by symbols: the rot, the mask, the burning fig. They passed secret writings sewn into hems and baked into loaves, messages scrawled in lemon juice and held over fire. They plotted not open rebellion, but revelation. If the people could truly see what Commodus was doing behind the silks and pageants, perhaps Rome might remember what it was meant to be. The conspirators were not idealists. They were survivors, senators, scribes, even members of the imperial household. Chief among them was Lucilla, Commodus's own sister, a woman of rare intelligence and bitter resolve. Lucilla had once been married to the co-emperor Lucius Verus, and after his death, she was pushed aside in favor of her younger brother's rise. She had watched the palace fill with blood and incense, seen her friends disappear into rooms that never opened again, and she had waited. In the spring of 182 CE, Lucilla gathered her co-conspirators in a suburban villa beneath the cover of a birthday feast. Among them were senators Claudius Pompeianus, Quintianus, and the ambitious Praetorian officer Tarentinus Paternus. Their plan was simple, almost crude. Quintianus, a nobleman with a mind more fire than foresight, would hide a dagger beneath his robe and approach the emperor during one of his public appearances in the amphitheater, offering the usual flattery before driving the blade into his heart. The others would rise in support. The guards, they hoped, would be stunned. The crowd would panic, but chaos could be reshaped. Rome would survive. What they did not count on was Commodus's increasing paranoia. He had begun to read omens in everything the shape of smoke, the way his wine rippled, the pattern of bird droppings on his sandals. On the morning of the planned assassination, he refused to enter the arena. He claimed he had seen a crow fly backwards and demanded an exorcism of the sand. Quintianus, already half mad with anticipation, could not be calmed. He approached Commodus in the palace hallway anyway, whispering, "This is what the Senate sends you," and lunged but too late, too clumsily. The blade barely scratched the emperor's chest before guards seized the would-be assassin and tore him apart in the corridor. Not executed, torn, flesh from bone, on orders. Lucilla fled, but was captured days later, hiding beneath the robes of a temple priestess. What followed was not merely punishment, it was declaration. Commodus ordered the names of the conspirators be engraved onto bronze plaques and placed outside every bathhouse, every forum, every temple. Their families were hunted down. Sons were castrated and made into palace eunuchs. Daughters were auctioned as vessels of penitence. The conspirators themselves were killed in symbolic ways. Lucilla was exiled to Capri and then, a week later, stabbed in the neck with a needle while bathing. Paternus was made to drink wine until he vomited blood. His corpse was displayed in the wine market. But the most grotesque retaliation was reserved for the Senate. Commodus declared a new series of public games called the Purging of the Proud. For 30 days, citizens were invited to watch reenactments of the conspiracy. Actors dressed as Lucilla, Paternus, and Quintianus were paraded through the streets, whipped, beaten, mocked. Then they were replaced with actual prisoners dressed in the same costumes, marched into the arena, and dismembered limb by limb in carefully orchestrated performances. At the heart of it all stood Commodus, robed in gold, his face painted with divine oils, shouting, "Thus dies treason," before plunging a dagger into the chests of the condemned. The dagger was named Voice of Mars. It was sharpened each morning on the bones of those executed the night before. The crowd cheered, or perhaps they wept. It no longer mattered. The lines between celebration and mourning had long since dissolved. The games had become the empire. Commodus had become the god of vengeance, not because he was just, but because he had made justice meaningless. Behind the curtains, Marcia, his concubine, lover, and secret keeper, wept without tears. She had loved him once, or thought she had. Now she watched him sleep surrounded by wax statues of his enemies, which he ordered kissed before bed. Each night, he asked her to name someone who smelled of doubt. Each night, she did, to keep herself alive. The Praetorian Guard, once Rome's final defense against madness, had become participants in the rituals. They carried out arrests with theater, beat confessions from ghosts, and chanted hymns written by Commodus himself. Their leader, Latus, was growing uneasy, but his face, like the others, remained carved from stone. The city rotted from within. Plague returned, crops failed, merchants fled, and still, Commodus demanded more rituals, more spectacles, more proof of power. And yet, beneath it all, something was changing. The whispers were returning, not in cellars, not in letters, but in silence. People had stopped speaking Commodus's name in public, not out of fear but out of disdain. His statues were no longer kissed, his decrees no longer read. A vacuum had opened in the soul of Rome, and silence was filling it. And within that silence, the next betrayal was already being carved. It began not with a shout or a blade, but with parchment. A single, unassuming scroll slipped beneath a market stall on the edge of the Forum Boarium. Its words were simple: no names, no accusations, only a question: if gods must hide behind guards, are they gods at all by dawn? 4 more copies had been found in other districts, then 20, then hundreds. None were signed, none needed to be. The message was clear. Rome had begun to question Commodus not with rebellion, but with thought, and in a city drunk on spectacle, thought was the one thing still forbidden. The scrolls spread like fire laced with incense, their words whispered through alleyways, inscribed onto wax tablets, scrawled in chalk beneath the arches of aqueducts. They called it the silent ink, this movement of ghosts and murmurs, born not of noble blood or military might, but of Rome's memory itself, the memory of a time when emperors bled for the people, not the other way around. Commodus responded as he always had with theater. He ordered the construction of a massive stage in the heart of the field of Mars, more elaborate than anything seen before. Towering columns of lapis lazuli, curtains stitched from the sails of captured pirate ships, statues of himself with the heads of lions, bears, serpents, all coiled together in divine parody. This would not be a play, he declared, but a revelation of loyalty. Every senator, every general, every nobleman was ordered to attend. Their absence would be noted, their reactions recorded. The performance began with dancers dressed as virtues: justice, valor, piety, all shackled and dragged across the stage by masked figures meant to represent the traitors of Rome. Commodus appeared last, naked save for a lion's pelt, painted from head to toe in red clay, claiming to be the embodiment of the empire itself. He roared, struck down the dancers with a golden club, and shouted into the sky, "Let no shadow hide from Hercules." The crowd cheered because they had to, but behind their applause was a tremor, a crack in the mask of devotion. That night, the city guards found a parchment nailed to the statue of Marcus Aurelius Commodus's own father, defaced to the point of unrecognizability. It read, "The son has killed the father twice, once in life, and once in memory." And for the first time in years, Commodus did not sleep. He raged through the palace like a storm trapped in flesh, overturning tables, tearing tapestries, demanding blood without names. He accused his concubine Marcia of sedition, then wept in her arms a moment later, begging her not to leave him, to swear she had never doubted his divinity. She lied. She kissed his forehead, and she left the room with the taste of iron behind her teeth. That same night, a low-ranking scribe named Aemilianus, thin, hunched, nearly invisible in the sprawl of the imperial bureaucracy, stumbled across something not meant for him. He had been cataloging storage in the substructures of the Palatine, dusty records of grain distribution and slave manifests, when he noticed a narrow crack in the wall behind a rusted bust of Emperor Hadrian. Curious, he pried it open, revealing a passage lined with stale air and silence. What he found was not just a room, it was a vault, a collection, a museum of obscenity curated by the emperor himself. On stone tables lay the remnants of what once were men, or pieces of them, a foot preserved in pitch, a hand nailed to a wooden cross with the ring still embedded in swollen fingers, a jawbone carved with the words, "He spoke too soon." There were jars filled with tongues, ears, pieces of scalps, masks made from human skin, their features twisted into caricatures of senators, robes soaked in blood, folded neatly as if waiting to be worn again. In the center of the room was a man barely suspended by iron hooks driven through his shoulders, naked, eyeless, lipless. He was still breathing. Emilianus fled. He told no one, not directly. But in the coming days, a dozen more discovered the chamber. A merchant's son delivering oil, a prostitute chased by guards, a blind beggar who heard the weeping. Words spread not in shouts, but in widening pupils, in hands trembling too slightly to be noticed, in citizens who began to avoid the palace not out of fear, but revulsion. Then the raid came not by foreign invaders, not by armies, but by a decision, unspoken and shared among men who no longer needed language to conspire. It began within the Praetorian Guard. Quintus Aemilius Latus, commander of the guard, had once been loyal. But he had watched too long. He had seen too much. He had collected the corpses of those who had merely blinked at the wrong time, buried their children with hands that no longer shook, and signed orders that smeared blood across the wax. Now, he acted. He met with Marcia and Eclectus, the emperor's chamberlain. In a garden once used for lotus meditation, they sat beneath a fig tree and mapped the moment. The poison would be added to Commodus's wine, not enough to kill him outright, but to weaken. Then, while he drifted between vision and sickness, the final blow would come, not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, private horror he had so long inflicted on others. But fate, like fire, often disobeys. On the eve of the plan, Commodus announced a new decree on New Year's Day. He would enter the Senate in gladiators' garb, unarmed, and challenge every senator to single combat. Those who refused would be beheaded. Those who accepted would be chained and stripped, forced to fight while the emperor danced around them. The people, he claimed, would finally see which bloodline was stronger, steel or scroll. Rome shuddered. That night, Marcia prepared the wine herself. She mixed the poison with honey and fig pulp, served it in the cup carved from a tiger's femur. Commodus drank. He laughed. Then he began to vomit, not blood, but foam of froth that bubbled at the corners of his mouth, staining the lion pelt around his shoulders. He collapsed in the bath. Latus ordered Narcissus, a wrestler and former gladiator, to finish the deed. The man entered quietly, stepping through candlelight and steam, found the emperor half-conscious, eyes wide with something not fear, but awe, as if he had finally seen a god. And it wasn't himself. Narcissus choked him, not with a blade, with his own hands. Commodus thrashed, clawed, tried to speak. His mouth made shapes but no sound. His fingers scraped the marble edge of the tub until the nails broke. When he finally stopped moving, the palace exhaled. His body was wrapped in linen and placed in a hidden crypt, far from the tombs of other emperors. No funeral games, no mourning period. His statues were quietly dismantled, his name scratched from coins, his laws annulled. Even the calendar was rewritten to remove the months he had renamed in his honor. But the city did not rejoice. It could not. Rome had survived barely, but something sacred had been broken. In the days that followed, a group of children found the vault beneath the palace. They wandered in, giggling at the hidden passage, and emerged sobbing, silent, changed. One of them never spoke again. The chamber was sealed, but not destroyed. There are records that the jars were buried beneath the temple of Vesta, that the robes were burned with sulfur in a field outside the city, that the man on the hooks, somehow still alive, was allowed to die with a priest's hand on his brow. None of this has been confirmed. None of it needs to be. The truth is not what was hidden. The truth is what was known and allowed. Commodus had reigned not only through cruelty, but through complicity. The people had clapped, the senators had bowed, the guards had held the chains, the scribes had copied the decrees, the artists had painted him as God. And when he died, what remained was not relief, but rot. His body lay still beneath the earth, but his shadow did not. Commodus, Emperor of Rome, son of Marcus Aurelius, butcher, demigod, tyrant performer though choked to death in his own steam, refused to vanish. His name had been erased from marble, stripped from coins, and his decrees nullified with the flick of a senator's hand. But there was no verdict that could nullify what had been seen. Rome had not merely tolerated him, it had adapted to him, absorbed him, and in many places, become him. His death was not announced publicly for 3 days. The palace had to be cleansed, not in the religious sense, but in the literal blood washed from floor tiles, bones removed from beneath potted plants, masks of human skin unstitched from columns where they had hung like grotesque banners of a forgotten war. Marcia herself oversaw the quiet disposal of his private relics, the jawbones, the sewn lips, the preserved genitalia of those punished for imagined lewdness. They were burned in silence behind the temple of Saturn. The fire lit at night with no witnesses, but a deaf slave who could not carry stories to the street. Latus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, declared Pertinax the new emperor a reluctant choice, a stopgap, an old senator whose hands still trembled from the memory of Commodus's games. His first official act was to restore the calendar. His second was to issue an edict condemning Commodus as a tyrant, declaring his reign damnatio memoriae condemned in memory. Statues were pulled from public spaces and shattered beneath hammers. Inscriptions were scraped from monuments, portraits painted over, busts melted down. But you cannot kill what you have already taught people to swallow. The theater remained, not just in the Colosseum, where blood still soaked the sand as if refusing to dry, but in the very rituals of power. The Senate, having watched its peers flayed and drowned, now flattered Pertinax with the same oily reverence once shown to Commodus. The people cheered the new emperor, though their hands still remembered how to applaud with fear. Even the soldiers, many of whom had guarded the door while madmen screamed behind it, now wore new tunics, but carried the same silence. It became clear to some that Commodus had not ruled alone. He had ruled through others through their eyes, their silences, their appetites. He had tested the boundaries of horror, but it was the world around him that had failed to draw the line. One senator, anonymous in the records, wrote in a private letter, "What we called madness in him was only a reflection. He mirrored our decay with the candor of a child holding up a skull. We did not look away. We clapped. Not all had forgotten. In the outer districts, whispers returned, tales of the vault of flesh beneath the Palatine, of a man sewn at the mouth who had bitten through his own face, of a priest whose fingers were found buried in the forum, arranged to form the sign of the evil eye. Children dared each other to walk the old alleys where Commodus had paraded his chained lions. Some claimed the stones still echoed with screams if you pressed your ear close enough at dusk. And in the countryside, strange shrines began to appear. Not grand, not public. Hovels of wood and bone tucked into groves or hollow trees, where offerings were left scraps of meat, fragments of dolls, tokens carved with the emperor's twisted likeness. These were not acts of devotion. They were acts of fear, superstition, the logic of trauma, as if Rome itself suspected that Commodus, having died without punishment, might return. After all, there had never been a trial. There had been no tribunal, no formal condemnation beyond bureaucratic proclamations. His killers were never tried, his victims never named. Rome simply moved on. But history is not a scroll that can be edited. It is a body, and like all bodies touched by rot, it remembers. Marcia was found dead 5 months after his assassination. Poisoned, most believed, though no culprit was ever named. Her tongue had turned black. Her eyes were sealed with wax. Some said it was revenge by loyalists. Others said she had finally eaten what she had helped cook. Latest lasted longer, 2 years. Then he, too, vanished from records after a failed attempt to elevate another puppet emperor. Some claimed he ended his days hiding in Hispania under a false name. Some claimed he walked into the Tiber carrying a lion's pelt and whispered, "Forgive me, Hercules." The empire churned. 5 emperors rose and fell in a single year. Assassinations became administrative tasks. The games continued, though with less elegance. Rome had learned that cruelty worked, that fear could be made sacred if dressed in ritual. And Commodus, the man who had made hunger a religion, who had twisted love into spectacle, who had turned the Senate into props, became a rumor, a ghost that haunted every chamber where power was spoken too loudly, a shadow behind every curtain in the new imperial palace. A century later, when a child emperor asked his tutor why a certain year had no name on the rolls, the tutor replied, "There was a man who wished to be remembered as a god. We remember him now only as a wound." But even wounds can fester. In 312 CE, during the reign of Constantine, a fire destroyed part of the archives beneath the Palatine Hill. In the rubble, charred bones were found human, twisted, fused together in ways that defied anatomy. Alongside them, a bronze medallion bearing the face of Commodus as Hercules, teeth bared, eyes hollow. No one claimed the find. The vault was resealed, the area declared cursed. And so, Commodus did not receive a sentence. He received only silence, not the silence of peace, but the silence of complicity, a stillness that smells of old blood and forgotten prayers, a hush that clings to stone and breathes in echoes, a silence that endures. Beneath the cobblestones of Rome, there are layers that time does not erode. The marble erases names, the laws rewrite titles, but the earth remembers. In the still hours before dawn, when mist rises from the Tiber and the pigeons sleep, One might walk past the ruins of the Domus Augustana and feel something watching, not a spirit, not a memory, but the shape of a man who believed suffering could be sacred and who proved it by living as proof that the line between man and monster is thinner than a thread of golden stitch through flesh. The games have ended. The blood has dried. But Rome still listens. The throne is empty now, not in marble or title, but in essence in that quiet space where authority once held purpose, and where, now, only ghosts remain. Beneath the frost-chipped stones of the old imperial chambers, dust settles on corridors no longer swept, on murals flaked by centuries, on cisterns that once caught the overflow of 1,000 prayers unspoken. The lion's pelt has rotted, the golden club has rusted, and the screams so carefully rehearsed, so artfully inflicted, have faded to an echo too faint for ears, too persistent for memory to discard. The vault was sealed, but not forgotten. It rests beneath layers of civilization, beneath layers of denial, whispering still, in dreams, in myths, in the hollow stares of those who walk the ruins and feel cold without knowing why. Commodus died without trial, without last words, without the dignity even tyrants sometimes claim. And yet his legacy is not in the manner of his death, but in the ease with which he was obeyed. In the hollow smiles of senators, in the rhythmic cheers of crowds, in every bowed head that looked away, and in every coin spent in silence. His punishment was erasure. But history does not forget its own nightmares. It buries them. And in that burial, the roots grow. Beneath the marble, beneath the silence, beneath the skin of the empire still beating faintly across the world. Not dead, not divine, merely waiting.